Captain Lee Tamin straightened his dark blue uniform jacket one final time as his family walked toward the bright, welcoming entrance of Stellar Bites restaurant. The massive space station called New Sol Station buzzed with activity around them. Ships from dozens of worlds docked and departed every hour, bringing travelers, traders, and families like his own to this busy hub of galactic commerce. His wife, Commander Park Nari, wore her finest off-duty clothes, a flowing silver dress that complemented her naturally blue-tinted skin. She held the hands of their 8-year-old, twin daughters, Lee Mina and Lee Hana, who giggled softly as they pointed at the holographic menu displays floating outside the restaurant. Their teenage son, Lee Jinwoo, walked beside them, checking his datapad to confirm their reservation time. The restaurant looked exactly like the advertisements Tamin had seen on the galactic networks. Warm golden lights spilled from tall windows, and he could see families inside, enjoying elaborate meals at tables covered with white cloth. And the smell of grilled meat and spices drifted through the air, making his stomach rumble. They had been traveling for 3 days, eating nothing but ship rations, and everyone looked forward to a proper family dinner. Table for 5 under Lee, Tamin announced cheerfully to the young human woman standing behind the host station. She wore the restaurant's signature red uniform and had been smiling brightly at the family approaching her desk. But the moment her eyes focused on his wife's distinctive appearance, her expression changed completely. The warm smile disappeared, replaced by an uncomfortable frown. Her gaze shifted from Nari's blue skin to the children's mixed features. They had inherited their mother's unusual eye color and slightly pointed ears, though they looked mostly human. "I'm sorry, but we don't accommodate mixed parties," the hostess said, her voice suddenly cold and formal. "Health regulations, you understand." Tamin felt his chest tighten with confusion and anger, but he kept his voice steady. "Mixed parties? We're a family. We made a reservation 3 weeks ago." "We have a confirmed reservation," Nari added calmly. Her words came out in her native language first, a series of soft clicks and musical tones, before her translator device converted them into perfect Korean. Even speaking through the machine, her dignity and grace were unmistakable. The hostess looked increasingly uncomfortable and stepped back from her station. "Let me get the manager," she mumbled, disappearing through a doorway behind the desk. The twins looked up at their parents with confused expressions. Little Mina tugged on her father's sleeve. "Daddy, why can't we eat here? Are we sick?" "No, sweetheart," he whispered, kneeling down to her level. "We're perfectly healthy. Sometimes people just make mistakes." But Tamin knew this was no mistake. His neural implant, a standard military device he'd kept after his service years, automatically began recording everything he saw and heard. Something told him this moment would be important later. A balding human man in an expensive suit emerged from the back office, his face set in a stern expression. A small name tag identified him as Manager Roberts. He looked at the family with obvious distaste, his eyes lingering on Nari's alien features and the children's mixed heritage. "Ma'am, sir," Roberts said, addressing Tamin but barely glancing. "At Nari, our establishment caters to human dietary needs exclusively. Our kitchen simply cannot accommodate alien digestive systems safely. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at the alien sector on level 7. Jinwoo, now 16 and old enough to understand exactly what was happening, stepped forward with clenched fists. "We eat the same food as everyone else. Mum's been eating human food for 20 years. Roberts held up his hand dismissively. "Son, I understand you're upset, but regulations are regulations. We cannot risk contamination or allergic reactions. It's for everyone's safety." Tamin felt his wife's hand slip into his and squeeze gently. He knew she was trying to keep him calm, but rage was building in his chest like a fusion reactor reaching critical temperature. Around them, other human diners had begun to notice the commotion. Several nodded approvingly at the manager's words. One elderly woman muttered something about keeping standards high. "Our money is the same color as everyone else's," Nari said quietly, her translator giving her words a mechanical precision that somehow made them more powerful. "Our children are hungry. We have traveled far." "I'm sorry, but my decision is final," Roberts replied, crossing his arms. "Perhaps next time you should call ahead and inform us of your situation. The twins began to sniffle, sensing their parents' distress, even if they didn't fully understand the situation. Other families in the restaurant stared openly now, some whispering among themselves. The beautiful evening Taemin had planned for his family was crumbling around them. "Come on," he said finally, his voice barely controlled. "Let's go find somewhere that actually wants our business." As they turned to leave, his neural implant continued recording every face, every word, every moment of this humiliation. He had no idea yet what he would do with this information, but something told him that Manager Roberts and Stellar Bytes had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. The doors of their private ship sealed shut with a soft hiss as the Lee family stepped aboard the sleek corvette they called Unity's Edge. The vessel was much larger and more luxurious than most freight haulers used, but none of the restaurant staff had bothered to look outside and notice it docked at the premium. Berths reserved for wealthy travelers. Inside the main cabin, comfortable leather seats surrounded a holographic display table. The twins Mina and Hana curled up together on a small couch, still sniffling from confusion and hurt. Jinwoo sat heavily in one of the chairs, his teenage face dark with anger. Nari moved gracefully to the ship's kitchen area and began preparing. Hot chocolate for the children, her movements precise despite her obvious upset. Taemin stood at the main viewport, looking out at the busy station where hundreds of ships came and went every hour. His reflection stared back at him, a man in his 40s wearing simple clothes, looking like any other merchant captain trying to make a living hauling cargo between the stars. It was exactly the image he had worked hard to create. "Dad, why?" "Didn't you tell them who you are?" Jinwoo asked, his voice cracking with emotion. "You could have made them sorry. You could have gotten us that table." Taemin turned away from the window and looked at his son. "Because then we wouldn't have learned who they really are," he said quietly. "If they had known my name, they would have treated us well for the wrong reasons. Now we know how they treat ordinary families who look like us." What his family didn't fully understand was that Lee Taemin was far from ordinary. While he did own and operate several freight ships, that was only a small part of his life. He was actually the heir to Lee Dynamics, the largest business empire ever built by Korean people. The company controlled everything from starship manufacturing to terraforming equipment, from mining operations to entertainment networks. It was worth more money than most planets produced in a year. The business had started with his grandfather, Lee Dae-jung, after the terrible Korean War that had lasted from 2157 to 2162. That conflict had scattered Korean families across the galaxy as refugees, but it had also taught them how to rebuild from nothing. Grandfather Lee had taken the refugees' skills and determination and built them into an economic powerhouse that now employed millions of people across hundreds of worlds. Taemin walked to his captain's chair and placed his hand on a hidden scanner. The ship's computer recognized him instantly, and suddenly the simple freight hauler's bridge transformed into something that looked more like a military command center. Multiple screens came alive with data streams, communication channels, and surveillance networks that stretched across human space. "Good evening, Captain Lee," came a pleasant female voice from the ship's speakers. "How may I assist you tonight?" "Hello, Hanbok," Taemin replied, using the code name for his personal artificial intelligence assistant. The name meant traditional Korean clothing, something his grandfather had chosen to remind them never to forget their heritage. "I need a complete analysis of a restaurant chain called Stellar Bytes. Start with their corporate structure and work your way down to individual locations." The AI began working immediately, accessing databases that most people didn't even know existed. Information flowed across the screens faster than human eyes could follow, but Hanbok sorted through it all in seconds. Stellar Bytes operates 1,247 locations across human space, the AI reported. Current market value is approximately 4.2 billion credits. The company went public 3 years ago and has been expanding rapidly into newly settled territories. "What about discrimination complaints?" Nari asked, walking over to join the conversation. Her military training had taught her to look for patterns that others might miss. More data scrolled past on the screens. "There have been 847 formal complaints filed against various Stellar Bytes locations in the past 2 years," Hanbok continued. Their complaints allege refusal of service to non-human customers, mixed-species families, and humans with visible alien modifications. However, the company's legal team has successfully dismissed most cases by claiming health and safety regulations. Jinwoo leaned forward in his chair, suddenly very interested. They've done this before to other families. Many times, Taemin confirmed, studying the data with growing anger. And they're getting away with it because they're careful to operate in systems where the local laws are weak or poorly enforced. This is interesting, Nari observed, her blue eyes scanning the corporate information. They're expanding specifically into territories where the Korean Reconstruction Doctrine should protect families like ours. Someone is either ignoring the law or doesn't think anyone will enforce it. The Korean Reconstruction Doctrine was a set of laws passed after the war, designed to prevent the kind of discrimination that had helped cause the conflict in the first place. It guaranteed equal treatment for all humans and their families, regardless of their appearance or the species, for they had married. The laws were supposed to be enforced throughout human space, but clearly some businesses thought they could ignore them safely. Taemin sat down slowly, his mind already beginning to form a plan. Hanbok, I want everything. Financial records, supply contracts, real estate holdings, executive profiles, stock information, legal vulnerabilities, everything. Certainly, Captain. This may take several hours to compile completely. Take all the time you need, Taemin said grimly. We're not going anywhere tonight. His family looked at him with curiosity and growing excitement. They were beginning to realize that their quiet freight captain father might have more resources than they had ever imagined. 3 days after the restaurant incident, Taemin stood in the most secure room of Lee Dynamics headquarters on Earth. The building rose high above the rebuilt city of Seoul, its glass walls reflecting the morning sun over mountains that had once been battlefields. Now those same mountains were covered with parks and monuments to peace, symbols of how his people had chosen to remember their painful past. The war room itself was a marvel of technology and history combined. Holographic displays showed real-time information from across the galaxy, but the walls were decorated with carefully preserved artifacts from old Korea. Ancient pottery sat next to modern computer terminals. Traditional paintings hung beside. Star charts showing Lee Dynamics operations on hundreds of worlds. Around the large oval table sat the most trusted people in Taemin's business empire. These were men and women who had worked with his family for decades, some since his grandfather's time. They had helped build the company from a small refugee aid organization into the most powerful Korean business in human space. Kim Soo-jin, the chief financial officer, was a small woman in her 50s who could calculate complex deals in her head faster than most computers. She had joined the company as a young accountant and worked her way up through pure skill and dedication. Her grey hair was pulled back in a simple style, and her dark eyes missed nothing when it came to money and business. Yoon Min-ho, the operations director, was a former military officer who had served in the final years of the Korean conflicts. He understood better than anyone how to coordinate complex activities across vast distances. His weathered face showed the stress of managing operations on over 300 worlds, but his mind remained sharp as a blade. Park Nari sat at the table wearing a formal business suit instead of her military uniform. Taemin had asked her to serve as special advisor for interspecies relations, a new position created specifically for this situation. Her blue skin and alien features looked completely natural in this room, where diversity had always been welcomed and valued. My grandfather rebuilt our nation from nothing after the unification wars, Taemin began, standing before a holographic display that showed the company's history. Images of refugee camps slowly transformed into pictures of thriving colonies and successful businesses. He taught us that strength comes from unity, not division. Today we face people who have forgotten that lesson. He activated another display showing the complete analysis of stellar bytes that Hanbok had prepared. Financial charts, corporate structures, and legal documents filled the air around them. The restaurant chain looked much smaller and more vulnerable. When viewed through the eyes of a multi-billion credit corporation, they humiliated my family, Taemin continued, his voice growing harder. But more importantly, they have done the same thing to thousands of other families. Families who don't have the resources to fight back. That ends now. Kim Soo-jin leaned forward and activated her own set of displays. Numbers and charts appeared showing Stellar Bytes' financial weak points. "We can attack them from multiple directions," she explained in her calm, precise voice. "We'll use our Altarian business partners to acquire their supply chains. They get most of their food from 3 major distributors, and 2 of those companies are already struggling financially." She pointed to another section of data. "At the same time, our Terran subsidiaries can corner their real estate holdings. Most of their restaurants are built on leased land, and many of those leases come up for renewal in the next 2 years. If we control the land, we control their ability to operate." Yoon Min-ho nodded approvingly. "Our reconstruction experience gives us another advantage," he added. "We know how to build businesses that serve diverse communities. We've been doing it for 70 years. They're trying to exclude the very diversity that built modern Korean prosperity. The irony is perfect." He stood up and walked to a wall display showing Lee Dynamics operations across the galaxy. "We have allies on every major world, partnerships with dozens of non-human governments, and business relationships that took decades to build. Stellar Bytes has made themselves enemies of all those relationships." Park Nari had been quietly reviewing legal documents while the others talked. Now she looked up with a serious expression. "This isn't just about one restaurant chain," she said firmly. "This is about the principles our people fought and died for. The Korean Reconstruction Doctrine was written with the blood of families who were torn apart by hatred and fear." She activated a new display showing discrimination complaints from across human space. "I've been documenting similar cases galaxy-wide. Stellar Bytes is just the most visible example of a larger problem. There are hotels that won't rent rooms to mixed families, schools that discourage non-human students, employers who find excuses not to hire people like me." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the scope of what they were seeing. This was bigger than revenge against one restaurant. This was about the kind of galaxy they wanted their children to grow up in. "My grandfather used to say that every crisis is also an opportunity," Taemin said slowly. "Stellar Bytes thinks they can discriminate against families like mine because we look powerless. They're about to learn that appearances can be very deceiving." Kim Soo-jin smiled for the first time that day. "How much money do you want to spend on this lesson?" "Whatever it takes," Taemin replied without hesitation. "Some things are more important than profit, but I have a feeling that doing the right thing is going to be very good for business." The meeting continued for hours as they refined their strategy, but the basic plan was already clear. Stellar Bytes had made the mistake of attacking not just one family, but the values that family represented. Now, they would learn the true cost of that mistake. The attack on Stellar Bytes began so quietly that nobody noticed at first. In food processing plants across dozens of worlds, workers received polite notices that certain ingredients would be temporarily unavailable. The kimchi that Stellar Bytes used in their popular fusion dishes suddenly became harder to find. Rice suppliers discovered unexpected problems with their shipping schedules. Spice merchants found their usual stocks running mysteriously low. Manager. Robert stood in the kitchen of his restaurant on New Seoul Station, staring at empty storage shelves. "Where's our weekly food delivery?" he demanded from his assistant manager. "The supplier says they're having problems with their main distributor," came the nervous reply. "Something about supply chain issues. They can't give us a date when normal." Deliveries will resume. What Roberts didn't know was that the main distributor had been quietly purchased by a small Altarian trading company 3 weeks earlier. That company was owned by a Terran investment firm, which was controlled by a subsidiary of Lee Dynamics. The supply chain had not broken down. It had been surgically redirected away from Stellar Bytes locations. At the same time, property management companies across human space began receiving official letters about lease renewals. The Stellar Bytes restaurant in the busy commercial district of Alpha Centauri received notice that their rent would triple when their lease expired in 6 months. The location on Mars Colony found out that their building had been sold to new owners who wanted to renovate extensively. The new owners were always different companies with harmless-sounding names like Harmony Property Holdings or Unity Real Estate Solutions. But every single one of them could trace their ownership back through a complex web of corporations to Lee Dynamics' real estate division. While Stellar Bytes struggled with supply problems and rising costs, their competitors began making attractive offers. A new restaurant chain called Galaxy Table appeared seemingly overnight, offering to buy out Stellar Bytes locations at excellent prices. Another company, Cosmos Kitchen, began opening beautiful new restaurants in premium locations that Stellar Bytes had been trying to secure for years. The managers at Stellar Bytes headquarters worked frantically to understand what was happening. Their stock price had begun dropping as investors worried about the company's ability to expand. Food costs had risen by 30% in just 2 months. Lease renewals were becoming impossibly expensive. Competitor chains seemed to have unlimited money to spend on the best locations. "It's like someone is deliberately targeting us," the Stellar Bytes CEO told his board of directors during an emergency meeting. "But I can't figure out who would have this kind of reach or resources." They were about to find out. On a Tuesday morning, exactly 3 months after the discrimination incident, Lee Tamin stood in a broadcast studio on Earth, surrounded by reporters from every major news network in human space. Behind him, holographic displays showed the logos of hundreds of companies, all connected by glowing lines that led back to the central symbol of Lee Dynamics. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice calm and professional, "I am Lee Tamin, Chief Executive Officer of Lee Dynamics. Today I want to tell you a story about my family's recent experience at a Stellar Bytes restaurant." The holographic display changed to show the security recording from his neural implant. Every word spoken by Manager Roberts played clearly through the studio speakers. Every dismissive gesture, every moment of humiliation was captured in perfect detail. The reporters watched in stunned silence as the scene unfolded. "My family was denied service not for our actions or character, but for our diversity," Tamin continued as the recording ended. "We were turned away because my wife is Altarian and our children are mixed heritage. This happened despite our confirmed reservation, despite galactic anti-discrimination laws, and despite the fact that we are Korean citizens protected by the Reconstruction Doctrine." He paused to let the impact of his words sink in. "Today, we demonstrate that hatred is not just morally wrong, it is economically unsustainable." Another holographic display appeared, showing Stellar Bytes' stock price in real time. As reporters watched, the price began dropping rapidly as investors realized what was happening. "Lee Dynamics hereby announces our intention to acquire Stellar Bytes Corporation through a hostile takeover," Tamin announced. "Our offer of 6.8 billion credits represents a significant premium over their current market value. We believe this purchase price is fair compensation for a company that has lost its way." The news spread across the galaxy faster than light-speed communication networks could carry it. On New Seoul Station, Manager Roberts sat in his empty restaurant, watching the broadcast on a small screen. His face had gone pale as he recognized himself in the security recording. Around the galaxy, other Stellar Bytes managers were having the same horrible realization. The Stellar Bytes board of directors held an emergency meeting that lasted only 15 minutes. With their stock price in free fall, their supply chains disrupted, and their lease costs skyrocketing, they had no choice but to accept Lee Dynamics' buyout offer. Roberts received his termination notice by electronic message while still sitting in his restaurant. The message was brief and professional, but he understood its meaning perfectly. He was unemployed, publicly disgraced, and facing a galaxy where everyone had seen his discriminatory behavior broadcast on every news network. As he packed his personal belongings into a small box, he finally understood the true cost of hatred. It wasn't just morally wrong. As Lee Tamin had said, it was economically devastating for everyone involved. 6 months after the acquisition, the transformation was complete. Every former Stellar Bytes location across the galaxy had been redesigned, from the ground up. The corporate red and gold colors had been replaced with warm earth tones and soft lighting that made every species feel welcome. The old menu boards that listed only human food had been replaced with holographic displays, showing dishes from dozens of different worlds. The restaurants now carried a new name, Harmony House. Each location celebrated the culinary traditions of whatever species lived in that area, But Korean fusion remained at the heart of every menu. Kimchi appeared alongside Alterian sea vegetables. Traditional Korean barbecue was served next to Centaurian grain bowls. The smell of garlic and ginger, mixed with spices that most humans had never encountered before. The very first location to reopen was the restaurant on New Seoul Station, where the original incident had occurred. Taemin had insisted on this symbolic choice. If the transformation was going to mean anything, it had to begin where the discrimination had started. On opening day, a crowd gathered outside the restaurant that had never been seen before in that part of the station. Humans stood next to tall, graceful Alterians with their blue-tinted skin. Short, stocky miners from the asteroid belt mixed with elegant diplomats from the core worlds. Children of every possible mixed heritage ran between their parents' legs, excited to see the celebration. Taemin stood before the entrance with his family, holding a large pair of ceremonial scissors. His wife Nari wore her finest traditional Alterian dress, its silver fabric shimmering under the station's lights. The twins, Mina and Hana, bounced excitedly in their matching Korean hanboks. Teenage Jinwoo tried to look serious and adult, but couldn't hide his smile. Behind the gathered crowd, almost invisible among the maintenance workers and station personnel, stood a familiar figure. Former manager Roberts wore the grey uniform of a junior sanitation officer, assigned to one of the most remote mining colonies in human space. He had traveled 3 days just to see this moment, though he stayed far back where no one would recognize him. My grandfather used to say that from the ashes of division, we build bridges of understanding. Taemin addressed the crowd, his voice carrying clearly through the station's speakers. Today, we prove that our strength has always come from our diversity. He raised the scissors and cut through the red ribbon. The crowd cheered as the doors opened, and families of every species began streaming into the restaurant. The first customers were deliberately chosen, a mixed human Alterian family with 3 children, just like Taemin's own family had been 6 months ago. Inside, the restaurant looked nothing like its former self. Round tables encouraged conversation between different groups. The kitchen was visible through large windows, where chefs from a dozen different species worked side by side. Children's play areas were designed to accommodate young beings of every shape and size. Translation devices were built into every table so that families could order in their native languages. The head chef, an elderly Korean woman named Park Sun-hee, had worked for Lee Dynamics for 20 years. She had spent months developing fusion, recipes that would appeal to every species while maintaining the authentic flavors that made Korean food special. Her kitchen staff included former Stellar Bites employees who had been retrained, along with expert cooks from across the galaxy. "Order, whatever you like," Taemin told the first family as they sat down. "Everything is on the house today." The little Alterian girl in the family pointed excitedly at a dish she had never seen before. "What's that one, Daddy?" "That's Korean bulgogi with Alterian sea vegetables," the server explained patiently. "It's sweet and salty at the same time. Would you like to try a small portion?" Throughout the day, similar scenes played out at every table. Species that had never interacted before found themselves sharing meals and stories. Children who looked different from each other discovered they liked the same foods. Parents who had been afraid to bring their mixed families to restaurants found a place where everyone was truly welcome. From his position at the back of the crowd, Roberts watched it all with a mixture of shame and amazement. The restaurant made more money in its first day than his version had made in a typical week. Families waited in line for hours just to experience something that had never existed before, a place where diversity was celebrated instead of feared. Within 2 years, Harmony House had become the most profitable restaurant chain in the galaxy, but the financial success was just the beginning. The restaurants inspired a new generation of Korean-led businesses to embrace interspecies cooperation. Hotels began advertising their welcome to mixed families. Schools started teaching children about different cultures. Even government offices began hiring more diverse staff. Roberts eventually found work on a terraforming project far from any major population centers. Sometimes late at night in his small quarters, he would watch galactic news and see reports about Harmony House's continued success. He understood now that he had been part of something much larger than just refusing service to one family. He had been part of a system that wasted the potential of billions of beings simply because they looked different. The transformation of stellar bytes had proven something important to the entire galaxy. Hatred wasn't just morally wrong, it was incredibly wasteful. When people worked together instead of fighting each other, everyone became stronger, more prosperous, and happier. Tamin's grandfather had been right all along. From the ashes of division, they had built bridges of understanding that stretched across the stars.